So my 9/11 story is not a lot different than yours, because that was when I was doing morning talk radio. I was on broadcasting in Hartford, Connecticut and Richmond, Virginia, simulcasting, doing a morning talk show, a la the Stern Show, where it's, a team, a group of people, it's lighthearted, it's fun, a lot of joking around. And if any drama, it's, usually reality show type drama on the show. It's never anything really serious. Now, I was lucky enough to be broadcasting from my home on Long Island. My team were all in Connecticut, and I had a studio in my house. And a lot of morning shows, like yours, they keep a TV on, news channel on in the studio all the time. I always had them turn it off because I'm like a moth with a flame. If I see a TV, my mouth falls open and I start staring at it, and nobody wants a morning show host staring at a TV. So we didn't run the TV in the studio. So we're on the air and we're joking around. We're doing the things that morning show hijinks. I've done everything from the sublime to the ridiculous. Ate a human placenta once. Walked through a car wash as a dare. All that stupid stuff that morning show guys do. And my producer says, "Hey guys, report came in. Plane just hit one of the towers of the World Trade Center." Now, the initial thought was some errant, Piper Cub pilot flew into one of the towers. That's I think I don't know if everybody's reaction, but everybody thought, it seemed, and it happened actually to the Empire State Building, like in the 40s, where a Piper Cub flew into the Empire State Building. So we're still kind of clowning around about it. Just like the stupidity of this guy. How do you hit the World Trade Center? You didn't see it, blah, 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 joke, joke, joke. Turn on the TV and you see the smoke coming out of it. And it's still tough to tell what's actually happened. But then while we're talking, we see the second plane approaching. And I think this is the way it was for many people. And it wasn't a Piper Cub. And it's headed right at the tower. And it hits and just dead air. Dead air. And then the next thing I said was, "I'm not feeling funny anymore. Turn on your news stations. We're gonna put on some music and we'll break in to report anything we hear. But you need to turn on the news." And we went to song, I remember it now, and I was home. So I ran out of the studio and I went to see my wife, and you see what's going on. And she was like, yes, she saw it, upstairs on the news. And she immediately went to get the kids. That was everybody's reaction. What's going on here? And interestingly, Mark the Animal Mendoza, the bass player of Twisted Sister, actually works with the police post-band in a civilian capacity. He's in communications. He called and he said, "Get your kids. This isn't over." And it wasn't like Mark took ever call. I don't think we spoke, actually. I'll get to that point. I mean, we hardly ever spoke. And the fact that he picked up the phone and called and said that, him and I had a lot of problems post Twisted Sister, but he was like, that all seemed insignificant compared to what was happening in the world. Suddenly your little arguments and your little things that seemed like mean the world to you really meant nothing in comparison. So my wife went to get the kids. I stood by the radio, and I don't think, and I don't remember how it was for you, but I don't think we did a normal show for weeks. We were on the air every morning, but it became just sort of a sharing of ideas and experiences, and people venting and counseling, and it became just sort of like the morning show, and it probably happened for you as well, just became a place for people to go with a group of people, the voice they know, the family they know. We were a pretty popular show by that point. It was like my third year on the air, and people were tuning in, but it was not to hear jokes or hear bits, or it was just they were looking for some sort of solace and sharing their anger, frustration, depression, sorrow. It just became this community on the air. Did you sort of experience a similar thing?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I remember that. How old were your kids, Dee, at the time?
Well, we're talking about 2001, right?
Right.
Everybody was in. My daughter was in kindergarten. My sons were in elementary school, and my oldest, he was quite a few years older. He was in the first year. So they were in elementary school. My wife went and scooped them all up.
And what did you tell the kids and how did you handle it with your kids?
I don't remember exactly, but I think with with the ones who were, well, they were like 10, 12, 17. Cheyenne was 5. She was in kindergarten. I don't think that she was the one we sort of guarded from the reality of just how ugly it was. But the 10 and 12-year-olds, kids today, but they're online. They're already like, even though they were young and we were insulating them, there was no hiding this. This was just everywhere. Everybody's talking. And, I liken it to when Kennedy was assassinated. I was in 3rd grade, maybe about 8 years old. And, I'm sure it was similar for the kids in school. I remember the teacher saying, a teacher coming in, Miss Finkelstein was my teacher, and my teacher running over, and he saw something very significant exchange. And then the teacher said, turn off the lights in the room, heads down was a thing back then, put your heads down, like nap time. I don't know what they were trying to do, but you're there and she started crying. Teacher was crying and adults were crying. And then they said, you're going home. And, so even though I was 7 or 8, I was fully aware that something significant was going on, and I became fully aware of what had happened rather quickly. There was no hiding it. You can only insulate the very, very young, 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds. They're picking up on mom and dad's reaction. Your parents are crying. What's going on? So I knew that at 8 years old, I was aware enough of that something significant was happening, and my parents, I don't know if they informed me or they had the news on or whatever, but I knew that you had to explain it to the kids as best you could, explain the unexplainable, and that really was what it was. It was, how do you explain something like that? It's just mind numbing.
Of course, it was different. It was different because we didn't see the images over and over and over again, like were shown on TV on 9/11. It was totally different with the Kennedy assassination. Well, you didn't even see footage basically of what had happened. It was just a different era for TV. Do you remember shielding the kids from TV at all? And do you remember any of their fears? Because I remember my daughter was, I think, a freshman in high school. And for the longest time, anytime a plane would fly overhead, she would get terrified.
Some of the early stuff that was coming out, the media, sometimes they can be too truthful and too honest. And they were running some images, and they were online, of people leaping out of the buildings and things like that nobody should see. Those are things that you can't forget. You can't forget that. And so as best we could, we tried, but it's like, this is 20 years ago. the internet, it's still the Wild West, but they're trying to reel it in now. They've been trying to reel it in, but 20 years ago, it was even more loosey-goosey. So you just couldn't plug up all the holes and all the access your kids had. And, and then kids talking to each other and sharing, did you see? And already there was phones with images on them and people, so it's very hard. So really the goal was to give clarity to the truth, not hide it so much, because I think it's impossible to hide. I mean, it was such a momentous event. It wasn't one man being assassinated, it was thousands being assassinated, and they were assassinated.
Did you happen to be touched personally? Did you know anyone who lost their lives?
In the neighborhood, yes. Like neighbors. My kids, went to school with the children of firemen and policemen and things like that. So at arm's length, and you saw that on a more personal level, somebody who was actually in the building, in the buildings. No, and you say thank God, but it's unfortunately, so many people weren't as lucky. So many people had that direct connection, that painful, brutal, direct connection. So we were fortunately blessed as to not have had anybody actually in any of the buildings that were killed.
Were you in any way involved musically afterwards, in the days, the months after?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I was saying how Mark Mendoza, who hated my guts, Twisted Sister had been broken up for 15 years, and we weren't speaking yet. The fact that he picked up a phone, it just sort of broke down that, like, whatever petty differences we had over the breakup of Twisted Sister, which is now well documented, it seemed very insignificant. And interestingly enough, this is just an aside, I'll tell you. I told you Mark was involved in communications. And if you remember, there was some significant, we found some real holes in the system. As we discovered now with COVID, we discovered holes in our system, and the holes of communication between state, federal, local agencies. You remember, they weren't communicating. Oddly, Mark the Animal Mendoza of Twisted Sister was one of the only people in the state of New York capable of communicating with all elements of law enforcement. He was picked up the day from his house on Long Island and brought to the bunker in New York at the Javits Center. Remember, they built the bunker down there, and where he was stationed, staying at the Notre Dame Hotel, or whatever that is. They've got the college hotel over there. But he was there for over 3 months in the bunker, as the center of communications. And one of the things he does now is teach. Over the last 20 years, he would be teaching. Mark the Animal Mendoza from Twisted Sister was teaching law enforcement on how to communicate together, and helped establish the system they now use to communicate. So don't discredit us heavy metal rock and rollers, And he said it was kind of funny, because a lot of celebrities would come down to the bunker just to thank everybody who was working there. And Matthew Modine, who Mark had partied with in LA back in the 80s, came down, and was walking down, thanking everybody, shaking everybody's hands and he got to Mark and he goes, Mark, like, what are you doing here? Like, well, that last place you think you find the bass player from Twisted Sister, who you were partying at the Rainbow with just, like 20 years earlier at the bunker with a headset on, but hey, that Mark the Animal Mendoza, yeah, to his credit. Now, that what you said about the band, that is what put the band back together. Eddie Trunk had a New York Steel show where he got a bunch of metal bands, Anthrax and Twisted Sister and Ace Frehley, Sebastian Bach, and to raise money for the EMTs and a lot of the families. And we were bands that nobody wanted at their concerts. You know, when the big concerts were held, nobody wants the heavy metal bands. I remember we called them and said, listen, everybody in the world is singing, we're not going to take it right now. And MTV was like, yeah, it's a little too angry. We're looking for something like, I think it's the time to be a little angry right now, but they didn't want Twisted Sister. But Eddie put together this thing, and JJ called and said, listen, man, JJ French lives in Manhattan. And the closer you are to Ground Zero, and you were very close, you got very, 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 very close to Ground Zero. You guys broadcast from near there. And but the closer you are, the greater the impact you felt. So imagine people who were listening to this, you know, you were in Oregon and you were like, oh my God, this is incredible. Well, imagine what it felt like to be in New York City when this happened. You know, I mean, those people, it just, forget it. Just the next, it just increased as closer you got. And JJ said, listen, I want to do something. And I realized there's nothing I can do that's of any value. All I do is play music. And I said, well, we can play music. And he called the guys and said, what do you think about getting back together for this cause? And to a man, we like, well, this is a reason to get back together. It wasn't about money. And the first several gigs, so after that, we went to Korea and played for the troops. The first gigs, Twisted's reunion, it was not about money. It was about charity and about helping others. And but we just said, yeah, because I think we were all thinking the same thing. What can I do? What do I? I'm an entertainer. You know, you realize how important your job is when something like this happens. You know, you're like, oh, nobody's got Dee Snider jumping around on stage and singing. Big whoop. You know, I mean, there are significant issues, and you really come to appreciate those frontline workers. Just as with COVID, you realize just how important these, little people. They're not little people. I always say, you think your job's important? What happens if you stop? Now, what happens if sanitation stops picking up your garbage? Pestilence, disease, rats. I mean, the plague. Okay, so yeah, so whose job is really important? I'd like to get my garbage picked up, please. I'll stop singing if you keep picking up my garbage, But Twisted reunited, and for that show with Eddie Trunk's show, and really glad we did. But that was like our gesture. Like, what could we do? Set aside petty differences and do something for the greater good.
And do you realize how important that was at the time? Just any normalcy, any entertainment, a lifeline, Dee.
Well, we didn't until we did the show and had those, firemen, firewomen, EMTs, EMS people, police coming up to us and thanking us. And we're like, what are you thanking us for? We felt helpless, but we didn't realize that we were helping them.
It did what happened on 9/11 at all change how you look at things, maybe look at life, look at social situation, politics, anything?
All those things do affect you, but at the time, wounds all heals all wounds. I was thinking about John Lennon's joke. Somewhere he wrote, "Time wounds all heals," but he wrote that somewhere on the back of a picture or something famously. And maybe it's a blessing and a curse that we forget. We don't forget completely, but we start to go back to normalcy, and maybe we need to. Maybe we can't operate with complete paranoia and fear of planes flying overhead. But to this day, any plane that flies anywhere out of the norm, or seems lower than usual, or seems like what's this plane? I've never saw a plane fly over here. I'm triggered by it, and it's got to be from that. It is from 9/11. Anything that seems out of the ordinary when it comes to planes or air travel, I immediately think, are we being targeted? It's kind of crazy, but that gets branded on your brain.
Is there anything else you want to add, Dee?
No, I think that, I think that's my story. And it's not as significant as others, but, everybody remembers it. And that's the most important thing. And it's good what you're doing because they need to remember. And sadly, new generations being born. And this is just, it's just something in the history books, something they're reading about. And it just doesn't have the same effect when we study it in history class as when you live it, and to see people and, who question the great catastrophes in history, question the Holocaust, question the lunar landing, which wasn't a catastrophe, question 9/11, the audacity. Talk to anybody who was freaking there, and you know. But now all the people who were there, not in our case, I'm talking about the Holocaust, are dying off. So the true witnesses are not going to exist anymore. And and there's more and more BS on the internet about how it was faked, how it wasn't true. I mean, it's just crazy, 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 crazy. So we need things like this to remind us and to remind future generations. So bravo to you for your effort.
Thank you so much, Dee.
My pleasure.